Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Newburyport Literary Festival online. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy to be able to bring these events to you online. I want to thank Mighty Blaze for partnering with us and live streaming some of the events today on Facebook. So this event is being live streamed right now over on a Mighty Blaze's page. I'm going to keep my remarks brief so that we can get started, but I just have a couple of housekeeping comments. We do have the chat enabled, but we ask that you use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom screen so that you can submit questions to the author, and I will help moderate that towards the end of the session. Please also note that in the chat window, we have links to 2 local independent bookstores. We hope that you support indie booksellers during this time of quarantine. So we have the links there for Jabberwocky Bookshop here in Newburyport and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. Whoops, excuse me, gotta grab my intro. I would like to introduce Ken Liu. He's an American author of speculative fiction. He's the winner of the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. His current book is The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, Liu worked as a software engineer, corporate lawyer, a litigation consultant. Liu frequently speaks at conferences and universities on a variety of topics, including futurism, cryptocurrency, history of technology, bookmaking, the mathematics of origami, and other subjects of his expertise. So welcome, Ken Liu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining me on this Saturday afternoon. I'm just so happy that we get a chance to meet and talk a little bit about books and stories. Stories happen to be my favorite subject and something I've spent a lot of time creating. So the talk today that I'm going to give on the value of stories and stories of values came out of me reflecting on writing as a result of writing this book. Oh, let me see if I can show it to you. Oh, okay. Zoom has this really wonderful feature of using virtual background, so you don't see the mess in my office. But I also have to be very careful about holding things in front of my face. So The Hidden Book and Other Stories is my latest collection. And while writing the book, I thought a lot about why I tell stories and why stories matter to people. You know, it turns out that there's a lot of very interesting scientific research on this. Human beings we are wired cognitively to understand the world through narratives, through stories, essentially. We don't have an intuitive understanding of data, statistics, probabilities, and that sort of way of understanding the world. We are much more able to grasp complicated facts and realities through narratives, through stories about cause and effect, about intentionality. You know, we're social creatures. We're shaped that way, so we understand the universe in that manner. And it turns out that for very important virtues, values, what have you, we don't understand these concepts in the abstract way. We don't understand them as abstract dictionary definitions. We actually encode these very important values for ourselves in the form of stories. So let me try to give you an example. This happens at the level of individuals, at the level of professions, cities, states, nations, entire peoples. We have these stories about who we are, what things we matter to us, how we're different from everyone else, at the level of individuals all the way up to nations. And these are foundational narratives that give us meaning, give our lives meaning. So for example, you know, at the level of individuals, whenever we talk about ideas like love, you know, for me, it's not an abstract dictionary definition. Whenever we talk about love in my mind, the way I understand that is I think about my grandmother and how when I was a little kid, she wanted me to be warm in the cold winters. And so she would knit these sweaters for me. And you know, she had arthritis and her skin tended to get chapped in winter. So I remember seeing her fingers just bleeding as she was knitting the sweater for me. And I got very sad. And I was like, Mom, why are you doing this? And she was just like, well, I don't want you to be cold. It doesn't hurt. I'm doing this because I don't want you to be cold. And that always just came to me every time I think about love, or something like what it means to be a good mentor. I think about when I was a young clerk working for a federal judge, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I made many mistakes. And one day, my judge called me into her chambers and just sat me down and said, you're not stupid. I don't. I wouldn't have hired you if I thought that to be the case. But you have to trust yourself that the reason you're making mistakes is because you just don't have the experience. You need to slow down and work it through. Trust yourself that you can figure these things out. And it was just a very routine interaction for her. She's done this for hundreds of clerks in her career. But it matters so much to me. It's a story I always think about when I think about what it means to be a good mentor. And I think all of you have stories like that. You don't understand important virtues and values to yourself in abstract dictionary definitions. You have some story in your heart from a family member. If you think about courage, it was because a sibling or a friend stood up for you in a moment when you needed them to. When you think about patriotism, you think about somebody who illustrated that for you in action. It's not, you don't understand these things in the form of abstractions. We understand these powerful values to ourselves through stories. So that brings me back to the whole concept of what do stories mean? I think a lot about, especially in today's world, when we're all stuck at home, terrified of this invisible enemy that the world is dealing with. And one of the things that I think a lot about is how can stories matter? Stories can't cure people. Stories can't be vaccines. Stories can't feed people. They don't seem to have any value at all in a pure economic sense. If stories were eliminated from the world, would we really be any worse off? And the answer is actually we would. As I mentioned earlier, we have these personal stories that we carry in our hearts that define what it means to be who we are. But stories also are a way for us to pass on our values collectively to the next generation and to our future selves, really, because stories are maps. They're guidelines of what it means to live a good life. And without stories that explain what it means to be happy, to be fully human, we risk losing all of that. And that really does matter a lot. Stories are, in fact, the way values are created in a very real sense, not just economically, but what it means to be a human being. And so I was going to talk to you about technology, which is, an area of my expertise, and stories about technology. But then I thought, you know what? That's actually not necessarily the best kind of story for a moment like this, because to be honest, a lot of science fiction stories are very bleak. They tend to be stories warning about the dangers of technology of the future. And I don't feel this is a moment when those kind of stories are most resonant with me. I actually tend to go back to the kind of stories I tell in my book. Here we go again. Yeah. In which the stories are not about technology really per se, even though technology shows up in a lot of them. They're stories about what it means to remain human. All of my stories are about the values of humanity. What does it mean to remain human in the face of cataclysmic change? And so I decided that the best way to talk to you about values is to actually go back to a different kind of literature, a kind of literature that I've had to turn to a lot in these days. I have 2 young daughters, and I read to them a lot. And I realized that children's literature actually is very, very valuable, because when we tell stories for adults, we often tell stories about cynicism, about terrible dystopias, about all the ways we're horrible to each other. But when we tell stories to our children, we often focus on stories about hope, about the ways in which we really care, the things that we really care about, the things that we want to have when we say that we're living a good life. And so I thought, you know, let's focus on children's literature and the kind of values that you can extract from those stories. So what I'm going to do is read you a few excerpts from some books intended for children that I really love a lot, along with my daughters. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the values we can get out of them. And then what those values can mean for us in a moment like this. So the first excerpt I'm going to read to you is from The Hobbit by Tolkien. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. I just love that. It conjures up such a powerful image, you know, of security, of being safe, of knowing your place. And notice what kind of house a hobbit hole is. It's a hole that you dig out of the ground yourself. It's a house that you create yourself. You have control over that environment. It's an environment that puts you close to nature. All right, I'm going to read you a second excerpt, and this is from The House at Pooh Corner. Halfway between Pooh's house and Piglet's house was a thoughtful spot where they met sometimes when they had decided to go and see each other. And as it was warm and out of the wind, they would sit down there for a little and wonder what they would do now that they had seen each other. One day, when they had decided not to do anything, Pooh made up a verse about it so that everybody should know what the place was for. This warm and sunny spot belongs to Pooh, and here he wonders what he's going to do. Oh, bother, I forgot. It's Piglet's too. I love that excerpt because, you know, there's nothing in it about ambition, about accumulating wealth, about doing, you know, respectable work. It's about seeing your friends. It's about sitting down together, just being contemplative, doing nothing at all, and telling each other silly stories and making up silly poems. In that kind of non-GDP contributing action, we find ourselves to be our truest selves. And then finally, I'm going to read you an excerpt from my favorite book to read to my daughters, Goodnight Moon. Good night, room. Good night, moon. Good night, cow jumping over the moon. Good night, light and the red balloon. Good night, bears. Good night, chairs. Good night, kittens. And good night, mittens. I love that because, you know, it seems superficially to be not even a story. You know, it's just somebody saying good night to everything around them. But if you think deeper about it, actually is possibly the most powerful thing, the most human thing imaginable. We are human beings because part of what we do is we attribute human-like qualities to everything around us. This is somebody saying goodnight to everything around them. And in that action, in that action of naming everything and calling forth their latent spirit, we're enacting essentially what Adam did in the Garden of Eden, where we're bringing life from this cold, dark, unfeeling universe, and we're making them into part of our self-identity, making them into part of what it means to be alive, to have named them, to have known them, to have endowed them with meaning, to have surrounded ourselves with objects that remind us of the very life that we lived. It's such a beautiful, powerful image. So now that I've read these excerpts, I want to sort of go back and talk a little bit about the stories and what sort of values they pass on. And I think these are the values we hold on to as we get through the pandemic and as we go really forward in all of life. The first value I want to extract out of them is the value of play. It's by play, I define as any activity that arouses and satisfies our curiosity, allows us to grow, or gives us just pleasure in being alive. And it's incredibly important to remind ourselves that play is what fundamentally makes a human human. I don't think most of us play enough, really. Honestly, the way you find joy in your work is when you can play at it. The way you find joy in anything you do, honestly, is to be playful at it. And so that's what I want to remind all of you. Remember to play. Remember to be like Piglet and Pooh, and just remember to fill your days with play. The second value I want to talk about is the value of being social. Turns out that a lot of how we feel joy is to be an individual who's embedded in a community. We need that interaction with friends. We need that contact, that kind of back and forth of being simply present in someone else's presence. We need that to be fully human. And so all of you, just remember that even though we're in isolation, we're doing physical distancing, but we're not actually socially distancing. We're trying to actually connect more than ever with those that we care about. And then the third thing I want to talk about is empowerment. So I mentioned earlier how the way a hobbit hole feels secure is because you have control over it. We love that sense of control over our environment, physical, virtual, social. And one of the terrifying things about the pandemic is that we don't feel that sense of control anymore. But the thing is, it gives us a chance to reflect on whether we're living the lives we want. How many of us really feel a sense of control over our physical environments, over the places we live in? Do we know how to? Do we have a hand in designing the places we live? Do we have a hand in creating the very physical space that we want to be in, or do we just find ourselves drifting into someone else's vision? And if we're not, in fact, living the life we want, then maybe it's time to think about how we can get closer to living the life we want to. The fourth one is about sustainability. So again, in all of these children's stories, you can see the incredible importance of humans as physical, embodied creatures. Nature sustains us both physically and spiritually. We're not apart from nature. We actually need to be very close to it. So children's stories, the literature we write for children, remind us over and over again how important that is. And then the final value, which is possibly the most important one I want to talk about, is the idea of self-definition and self-narrative. So I mentioned earlier how Goodnight Moon is such a powerful story because it's about how the world becomes meaningful as you name each object and make that object into part of your life. You're really putting yourself into everything around you. That's really what, you know, a life means. We want to be surrounded by objects of meaning. We want to be surrounded by tangible evidence that we lived a life that mattered, that we made a dent in the universe, that we brought joy to someone's life, that we created something that made the world a little bit better than we found it. And that kind of tangible putting ourselves out there into the world is what storytelling is all about. It's what technology is. Our entire history has been a history about how we externalize more and more of our inner lives externally. You know, writing is one of these technologies we invented to physically put what's in our heads out in the world so someone else can take it in. All of technology is about putting more and more of ourselves and our cognition, our minds out into the world, embody them in other objects. And this is a very physical metaphor for what happens in our inner lives too. We are continually trying to make sense of our lives by explaining to ourselves, telling ourselves a story about who we are and how we got to be here. You know, if you want to be purely rational, the physical universe is entirely random, and there are no causes and effects and plot. There's no plot, there's no character arc. You know, what's happening in reality right now, if you put it into a story, would be completely unbelievable. People would say that's just not plausible because, you know what, reality doesn't have to make sense the way that fiction does. But we can't live in a world in which nothing makes sense. So we have to constantly invent causes and effects and constantly come up with meaning for otherwise meaningless acts. This is both a negative and a positive. It's a negative in that sometimes it blinds us to reality, but it's a positive because storytelling is how we constantly, over and over again, give ourselves hope and give ourselves the strength to climb up and keep on going. So basically what I want to say is this sense of telling a story about our own lives, the self-narrative, we are, all of us, the heroes of our own epic fantasies. And this is what we do. You know, I'm an epic fantasy writer, and I think epic fantasy is a great metaphor for the way we give ourselves our own lives meaning. We are, each of us, the heroes of our own epic fantasies. And so the way you make values matter to you real in the world is to enact those values, turning them into stories that other people will remember in the same way that I remember my grandmother and remember the judge who mentored me, even though those actions are small actions in their lives. You, each of you and each of us, we have the capacity to do those things, to live out our values, to embody the virtues that we want the world to have, and then become inspiring heroes in other people's stories. This is how we pass our values on, not by talking, but by doing. So, you know, I want all of us to think about what values matter to us and how we can enact them, reify them, make them real, so that we become not only the heroes of our own epic fantasy, but also inspirational mentors and great inspiring characters in other people's epic fantasies as they continue forward generation after generation, drafting this unending story. Thank you very much. And I'm ready for some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was a great discussion there. And we have some questions already. So now that more and more of your works are being adapted into movies and TV episodes, do you have any guidelines or rules about your work that you give to the studios?
I don't actually. Here's what I believe about adaptations and media creations based on my work. I'm a big believer that stories need to be to embrace their medium. So a literary story, a story that you write, is a very different kind of creature than a story told through some sort of visual medium or dramatic medium. A faithful adaptation, whatever that means, is almost always a terrible adaptation because you cannot take a story that was originally organically intended for one medium and just transport it over into a different medium and hope that it's going to work. It's not. The ideal, and also, you know, as a storyteller, I'm focused on writing stories. So when I finish a story or a novel, that's what I wanted to do. I don't write these stories with the intent that they somehow become the raw material for someone else's creativity. You know, that's very disrespectful to myself and also to the folks who do the adaptation. I'm not interested in creating something just so that they can then work with that. I'm interested in creating something as an end in itself. This is it. This is the thing I wanted to make, and this is the beautiful thing that I wanted to leave behind. Adaptations, I think, are most successful when they take just the raw material, underlying material, and say, this is just a starting point. I'm not going to tell another story that in some ways has a soul that echoes the first story, but it's my story, meaning from the perspective of the filmmaker. I think those are the best kind of adaptations because it's its own separate thing. It's a thing that can be appreciated entirely separately from the story that the writer created in the first place. So my ideal setup would be one where there's the story I wrote, and then there's the film or TV series, and people will appreciate them both as entirely distinct things, each with their own unique strength and values to say.
So from Elaine, she says, I appreciate your presentation and especially the values via stories and play. I'm a 5th grade ELA teacher. I try to bring play, stories, and joy into my classroom. How can I sell the importance of this to my administration, who believe the most important thing we do is generate and evaluate data via frequent testing? It sounds like.
It's a great question, and it's a question I've asked folks a lot. I don't know. It's really hard because I feel in some ways we've trapped ourselves into this position where we keep on saying education is very important, but we don't agree on what the point of education actually is. Clearly, we need to measure, whether we're teaching or not, but we don't seem to know how to measure the things that matter the most. Our children learning the values that we care about the most, our children actually learning the stories, the narratives that matter the most, because fundamentally I'm a believer that good stories matter more than almost anything else, more than good institutions, more than productive citizens, more than any of this stuff. Because why? Because all the other stuff can be routed around if you have a shared vision, a shared story. If a people have a shared story that they can rally around, a vision for what it means to be one people, then almost anything can be overcome. They can invent almost any kind of solution to challenges. But without a shared story to guide them around, or a positive story to inspire them, none of the other things are on their own enough to sustain them. So, but how do you explain this to folks who are concerned about their children not being able to get the right scores, to get into the right schools, to get the right jobs, and so on and so forth? I have no idea. I don't know how to do that, because it sometimes feels like when you're arguing with people, you're talking entirely different languages. You say, well, but it matters that children play, that they appreciate the value of learning, that they learn how to learn. You can argue about this until you're red in the face, but to some people that never makes any sense, because children must get scores, good scores on tests. This is the only thing that matters. I don't know how to sell that other than to keep on tell stories, compelling stories about what it means. Perhaps remind the administrators, what actually mattered to them in their lives. Did they become who they are because they happen to have the best test scores, or because somebody inspired them to get into education in the first place? Because surely folks get into education because they were inspired to do so, not because there's riches to be found. That's in our society, that's not how you do it. You get into this because you really care about education. And then why do you care about it? Because there's a compelling story that moved you in there in the first place, and remind people of that story, and maybe that will help.
Yeah, actually somebody made a comment, students will never remember a test. They'll remember great stories and fun experiences. That's true. So I'm going to shift gears a little with a different kind of question. Let's see. Whoops. Ever since you coined the genre of silk punk with your incredible debut novel, Grace of Kings, have you kept track of the evolution of the genre? How do you feel about what silk punk has become today?
So I have to confess, I don't follow what happens to the word I coined. So a little bit of a history about how that happened. So I'm one of those writers who have a really hard time with genre labels. I really don't like to label my fiction as one way or the other. And partly that's because I don't really write stories that are easily classified one way or another. I mean, for example, right, one of my stories, The Paper Menagerie, won a bunch of awards. And I constantly get folks who come to me and say, I don't understand why that story is considered sci-fi. And I said, well, it's not. I don't know where you got the idea it is sci-fi. And they say, well, you got all these sci-fi awards. Well, it turns out that, that's actually not true. The awards are given for literature of the fantastic. So that's why. But there does seem to be this really difficult relationship where people want to put your stories into certain boxes, but stories by their nature don't really like being put in boxes. So when I was writing my epic fantasy, I was required as a part of the need to market books to explain what genre it was in. People wanted me to give them a one-word label that explains what the book is. And I was like, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it is fantasy, but the real magic is about engineering. I don't have wizards in the book who are heroes. I have engineers. Is it East Asian inspired? Sure, but it's also inspired by Anglo-Saxon epic poetry, which is a literature that I studied in college and was really deeply in love with. So I don't know quite how to describe it. So in the end, I said I'm going to invent a word for it. I'm going to call it soappunk, because it's silk, because it's a technology fantasy where the technology vocabulary and the prototypes were based on East Asian models. It's this idea of using materials available in East Asia to create wondrous machines. In the same way, steampunk is about using material common during Victorian industrial age in England industrial age to create this alternative fantastic technology future. So soappunk is about using material of historic importance in East Asia and techniques of importance in East Asia to create a technology culture. And the punk part is about being not easily classifiable, about being punks, about rejecting authority, about creating stories that are about the values of reappropriation, of rebellion, of revolutionary politics, of constitutionalism in the aftermath of the revolution, etc. So that's why I called it that. The entire genre was invented literally to describe my book. Now, once the word is out in the world, other people are free to use it to however they want. So the fact that other folks have taken up the label and decided to call their book soappunk is pretty awesome. It's not often that you invent something and then other people decide to actually take it up. So I'm very pleased to hear that, but I don't actually follow what other people mean by it. I invented the word to describe my book, and so that's what I'm going to keep on doing. The soappunk epic fantasy series, the Dandelion Dynasty, there's 2 books so far, The Grace of Kings and The Wall of Storms. There will actually be 2 more books to complete the whole series. The 3rd book is coming out early next year. It's called The Veiled Throne. So I'm super excited to share the books with readers. There's going to be a lot of exciting stuff happening, so I am excited.
That's great. We have so many questions and we're technically running out of time, but I actually do have a little wiggle room. So if you're game, I'll do a couple more questions.
Sure, if folks are able to stay, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's see, I'm trying to get something that is common here. As someone who has translated a lot of fiction written by others, can you talk about what this form of storytelling means to you, the storytelling of translating from one language and culture into another?
It turns out that's not all that unique. People often view that as some sort of very unusual form of storytelling. It's really not. If you think about it, we're doing that constantly. I mean, you hear some story in the news and your kids ask you about it. Now you have to sort of talk to them about it in an age-appropriate and contextual way. You have to explain whatever's happening in the world to them in a way that allows them to get what they need. That's a form of translation. All of us probably have the experience of growing up in one world and then going to college in a different city and then ending up working in some industry that we had no idea about as children. So the way you relate to your friends from grade school and the way you relate to your friends in college and the way you relate to your work colleagues, and if you switch careers, different people you get to know in different spheres, it's all very different. So you're constantly having to code switch and navigate between these worlds and explain what happened in one world to folks in the other. So you're always translating, telling stories from one context to the other. In fact, one of my jobs as a litigation consultant involved doing this all the time. Because my background was in law and technology, I was proficient with reading source code as well as legal briefs. So my job involved constantly translating between patent lawyers and engineers and trying to get the two sides to understand that how they can reorient themselves to accomplish the same task. So, I think if you think back to your own life, you're probably having to do this sort of thing all the time. And it's not very different. It's always a sort of a performing art. You're always trying to figure out what is the essence of the story you're trying to tell, and then how do you tell it in this new medium for a new audience in the way that makes the most sense.
What shaped your philosophy about storytelling and technology? Do you have any book recommendations?
Oh yeah, so so there's an economist whose name is Arthur Bryan, I believe, who wrote a book called Technology: What It Is and How It Functions, which I found to be just a beautiful book that shaped a lot of my ideas about technology. Because, we often think about technology in relation to, sorry, I think the author's name is W. Bryan Arthur. I have to look, I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong. But the way we think about technology normally is that it's just a sub-discipline of science. And it turns out that's not necessarily the best way to think about it. Technology actually is more like, or engineering in general is more like poetry, in that you're trying to take existing solutions and existing tropes, and you're putting them together in new ways to solve new problems. That's basically what engineering is actually all about. So engineering is much more of an art than scientific research. And that to me was very powerful because, for many years I actually worked in the technology industry, and that way of viewing technology as a kind of art, as a way of composing poetry, was much more resonant to me than other views. And so gradually, as I started writing stories about engineering, about what it means to be a great engineer, which are the epic fantasies, I ended up thinking more and more about this analogy between poetry and engineering, composing machines, and it was just all around a beautiful metaphor that I kept a hold of. If you read the Danzon Dynasty, you'll see that there's constantly this reference between the engineering characters explaining what they do in terms of poetry. That's where this comes from. And I sort of think of my entire set of science fictional stories as really about that. It's ultimately a celebration of engineering, which is the most important art that we now practice as a species, and how we use technology as the way to compose our modern epics, to explain to the universe essentially who we are as a species.
All right. Well, there are a lot of more questions, but I'm afraid we really are out of time. So I'm sorry to everyone that I could not get to all of them. But Ken, thank you so much for joining us. This was great. I really appreciate that you took time today to spend with us. And to all the attendees, thank you for coming to the festival. And we still have more events going on this afternoon. So hopefully everyone will still go to see something between now and the end of the day. And then also we have events on Sunday, May 3rd. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jen.